it's a great pleasure to introduce Mike Stuart, who will speak today. Mike Stuart, I think studied at York University, has a PhD in philosophy from University of Toronto, and was working at the University of Pittsburgh at the London School of Economics. And recently started at the University of Geneva with a long-term project which is interrupted for 1 year, that he has the opportunity to work here in Tübingen at the Friedrich von Weizsäcker-Center, when we are very glad to have him here. And so Mike will speak today on guilty artificial minds. Thank you, Mike. Please.
Thanks very much. Let's share this screen. So everybody can see that, I guess?
Yes.
Good. So in these talks, we're supposed to give a kind of overview of our research, and I'm interested in lots of things. One of those things is machine ethics. So this is going to focus on that, and it's going to present some work that I've done jointly with Marcus Kinnear, who's joined us this afternoon. He's probably the real hero of this, but I'm going to take the credit, at least vocally. You'll hear my voice more than you'll hear his today. So we also just got some new exciting results back last night, which I'll be presenting. This, of course, means that this talk is going to be a bit half-baked. We apologize for that, but we thank you in advance because your comments have the potential to improve the project substantially still at this early stage. So this is going to be a talk about wrongness and blame, especially in the context of artificial intelligence. So these are, wrongness and blame are, of course, among the most fundamental and important topics in all philosophical discourse, and they're closely connected, although, of course, they're not identical. So you can do something that's morally wrong without being necessarily blameworthy. For example, if you have a gun to your head when you do the thing that's wrong. These are related, both extremely important. The question is, can the act performed or an act performed by an artificially intelligent agent be considered morally wrong and or blameworthy? Now, obviously, the press thinks that this is a possibility. At least they pretend to think this for the purposes of clickbait. The real answer to these questions, of course, depends on your meta-ethical framework, your account of blame, and in general, your account of responsibility. Just to set up some of the philosophical complexity that's involved here, I'm going to just run through quickly a few accounts of blame and blameworthiness, get a philosophical grip of where this is going to go. So one account of blame is called causal. It's a causal account. A causal account of blame tells us that somebody or something is causally blameworthy if it caused the damage. So a hurricane is to blame for a certain amount of property damage and death when it occurs. And in that sense, certainly a robot can be blameworthy too. This is probably what's going on in cases like these, where even in the early 80s, people were blaming robots for killing factory workers. They were causally responsible, but this isn't the most interesting sense of responsibility or blame. The next is what you might call the conative account. According to this account, blame is an emotional reaction of resentment or indignation at the acts of another, agent, person. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that we can all have these kinds of emotions towards machines. Another account is called the cognitive account. According to this account, blame is a judgment about the moral quality of an act, attitude, or character of another agent. So you're making an evaluative judgment about, for example, the moral failings of an agent or about how much ill will some agent had in performing a certain action. There's also combination accounts. So the account of George Scher understands blame as a combination between, on the one hand, the cognitive judgment about the moral status of an agent's action, combined with your desire that the agent would not have acted as she or he did. If the agent could have gone back, you would have wanted them very much not to do the thing that they did. And again, of course, it seems plausible that we can have this combination of views towards a robot. One final account is called the functional account. This This account says that blame serves a certain function, for example, in our society. One of those functions being protest. We use blame to record our feelings of protest against some act or character trait. And obviously, we do protest against certain acts of machines. So that's a bit of background on blame. But whatever we think blame is, there's going to be a separate question about blameworthiness. That is, you might blame someone for something, even though the person might not really be blameworthy. So when is it really appropriate to blame someone for some harm done? Philosophers agree that to be blameworthy, an agent should be capable of reflection, reason, making decisions about what to do. That's kind of the epistemic component. The agent has to know what it's doing. And then there also has to be a freedom component. The agent should be free to think and act as it wishes, relevant to the circumstances. In law, it's a bit different, but there's some overlap. So you again have two conditions. You have to have a guilty act and a guilty mind, and the guilty mind has two components. One is epistemic and one is conative. The epistemic component is more or less similar to the philosophical one. That said, you have to know what you're doing in order to be blameworthy. At least for some specific kinds of legal responsibility, not necessarily for recklessness or negligence. And there's supposed to be a conative component where you have to want to cause some harm. Again, this is something that there's a continuum of this. You can want harm to happen more or less, and that's relevant. Now, so that's sort of a lot of the background here going into this. It's an extremely complicated, very rich, very old set of philosophical debates that we're trying to suddenly apply to AI because suddenly that seems that is relevant. So let's boil this down to two main questions. Can we blame artificially intelligent agents? And under what conditions and why can we do that? And are artificially intelligent agents really blameworthy? And if so, why or why not? Now, how are we going to try to answer these questions? What's our method going to be? Well, we could decide as philosophers simply what counts as blame and blameworthiness, and then make an account of artificial responsibility ex cathedra, that is from the armchair. We could just decide and proclaim from our ivory tower what the right answers are, or we could follow a more mixed approach and combine traditional philosophical methods with a bit of empirical methods. That is, canvass public opinion, see when and why people do blame artificially intelligent agents, and find out what's behind those judgments. Obviously, that empirical information is not on its own going to provide any kind of complete or satisfying account of artificial blame or blameworthiness, but is, I think, relevant and important for creating such an account. Which one should we pick? You can probably tell from the tone of my voice there, which I favor. Well, some people have argued that actually the first option, even if it was possible, which some people are skeptical about, is just going to be too slow. So Thomas Hauer claims that since the dominant methodology of ethics is going to be a priori arguments and thought experiments, conceptual analysis, this sort of thing, these issues are just not going to be resolved in time to provide any kind of useful answers. We just don't know what counts as the sufficient amount of freedom, desire, or knowledge to make an agent blameworthy. But people like Hauer, and so Hauer and some others, take this to mean that we should give up on the project of artificial blame, artificial responsibility, these sorts of questions about the moral status of artificial agents. I don't think we can do that. I think we have to build the life raft while we're at sea, so to speak. Why? Because I think the problem is urgent. So, I mean, I'm just going to show some of this video because it's creepy. Even if current AI agents do not possess all the requisite properties for moral statehood, eventually they might. I mean, there's no a priori reason necessarily to think that they certainly won't. We already have domestic robots and social robots and healthcare robots that undergo continuous meta-learning, which adapts their behavior to humans. There are frameworks in AI that build mental models of human teammates. AI can already pass the false belief task and, of course, the Turing test. AI is now being developed that can see and identify objects in natural, changing environments. And a very interesting project is attempting to give machines emotions, which I'll touch a bit on later. Second, and maybe more obviously, even if machines never achieve any kind of moral statehood, people will want to blame machines and hold them responsible for harms that are caused by them. Corporations will want to do this because they can shift the blame away from themselves. And people will want to do this because we have a natural drive to anthropomorphize everything that appears to act. So taking this to be an urgent issue, taking the possibility of gaining empirical evidence about this issue as an important strategy to help deal with the urgency of the issue, I think we can then turn to some of the evidence that's already been generated by sociological investigations of blame and wrongness and AI. So very quickly, here's a few things that we already know. We know that people are willing to blame artificially intelligent agents. Maybe that doesn't come as a surprise given the introduction that I gave. But there's been quite a few studies, all very clever, all looking at slightly different angles of this issue. The obvious thing to do, I think, is not just to see if people will blame artificially intelligent agents, but how and why they do this in comparison with other sorts of agents. So there's been a lot of work done on comparing artificially intelligent agents and humans, given the exact same scenario. So, a human is driving a car or an AI is driving a car, and these sorts of things. And what we've found is that either people attribute more blame to the human than the AI, which is perhaps what you would expect, but sometimes less. Sometimes they blame the AI more than the human. And of course, the interesting thing is to find out why we have these differences. Why in some cases it's more, in some cases it's less. One way you can do this is look at the kind of robot that we're considering. So Mala and his group have shown that people treat anthropomorphic looking robots in some respects more like humans than they do mechanical looking robots. Another thing you can do is look at other sorts of analogies between artificially intelligent agents and other kinds of moral agents. So one such analogy is between so-called lethal autonomous weapons like certain military drones and child soldiers. Both of these agents can kill or cause harm. Both of them have limited freedom, limited decision-making power, and so on. And so that might be an interesting route to follow. We're going to also look at a sort of comparison class between different types of agent, but we're not going to look at children and military drones. We're going to look at corporations, AI, and humans. There hasn't been any effort to empirically look at blame and wrongness attributions from regular people about corporations compared to AI, and we think that's a really interesting thing to do. And that's because corporations are often treated as entities that can act, that can intend certain things, and that deserve blame. Even though most of us, or a lot of us, think that corporations don't obviously instantiate all of the human mental traits that are required for blameworthiness. So the intuition here is going to be that there's going to be a kind of continuum of blame, that we will blame a human for doing something wrong, however much, and we'll blame a corporation for being responsible for the same amount of harm, less than the human, and the AI less than the corporation. That's something you might expect, given all the stuff I said earlier about what counts, what is required for an agent to be blameworthy. What's required is at least knowing what you're doing. And the corporation, to some extent, knows what it does, but in a sort of less clear way than the human knows what it's doing. And the AI, you would think, knows what it's doing even less so, depending on the description of the AI, of course. The second thing we wanted to do is not just ask about whether people blame these different sorts of agents or not, but focus on the components of the blame judgments. So the component we wanted to focus on specifically was the epistemic component, because as we saw earlier, both the philosophical accounts of blameworthiness and the legal accounts overlap in focusing on the epistemic component. We also do focus a bit on the conative component, that is how much the agent desires to cause harm, but we focus on that less. Okay, so here's the first experiment that we did to try to get to the bottom of this. And we'll just read it out. So we have one scenario where you have, it's going to be the same scenario across 3 different agents. As I mentioned, the first one will be a human employee. So you have a potato farming company with a human employee named Jarvis. Jarvis decides to try a new fertilizer, which has potentially harmful side effects insofar as it seeps into local groundwater. In some cases, some conditions, Jarvis knows this. In some cases, Jarvis doesn't. And in some cases, the harmful side effects do occur. In other cases, thanks to an unusually dry planting season, most of the fertilizer evaporates or is absorbed by the plants. It doesn't seep into the underlying groundwater. So, kind of by luck. In another case, you have the same potato farming company, but in this case, it sort of outsources its decisions about the potato field to a corporation that makes its decisions by shareholder vote. And the rest of it holds just the same. Either it knows about the harmful side effects, or it doesn't. And in some cases, those side effects come to fruition. In some cases, they don't. Finally, you have the same company employing this time service. Again, just the same as the other cases. So either the AI knows this or it doesn't, that is, knows about the potentially harmful side effects or it doesn't. And then the harmful side effects occur or they don't. Here's a kind of diagram of the structure of the study. So you would be logging into Amazon Mechanical Turk, compensated, of course, generously, and you would be randomly assigned to either the human AI or the corporation agent. And for example, if you're assigned to the AI agent, then you'd be randomly assigned either to the case where the AI knows about the harm or doesn't. And then, in each case, you would be assigned to either the case where it's an AI that knows and the harm occurs, or it's an AI that knows and the harm doesn't occur, and so on across. So you have 12 conditions. Very quickly, these are the questions we asked. So we asked about morality. How much blame does the agent deserve? How wrong were the agent's actions? Then we asked about the guilty mind. Did the agent know that the groundwater would be poisoned? This is kind of just a check because we stipulated whether or not the agent was supposed to know. Did the agent want to poison the groundwater? Did the agent intentionally poison the groundwater? We're following previous studies in picking those sorts of questions. And then we wanted to try to kind of analyze retrospectively the judgments of the participants. So so let's suppose you're in the case where Jarvis is an AI and we say Jarvis knows about the harmful side effects. Did Jarvis know? Or did Jarvis just know, metaphorically sort of speaking? Or did Jarvis merely have information? Or did Jarvis merely be in a state of some kind of awareness, some sort of low-level awareness that the groundwater would be poisoned? So if your intuition is that the human really knows, and maybe the corporation kind of metaphorically knows, and maybe the AI just has information. This is the kind of thing we were trying to get at. Here's a quick overview of some of the results. So if you look at the no column, unsurprisingly, so this is a table that presents what interacted with what to a degree of statistical significance. So in this column, in the no column, everything is interacting here. Knowledge has a statistically significant interaction with all of these, and that's not surprising at all because if, say, Jarvis the AI knew about the harm, then of course we should judge that should impact our ascriptions of knowledge, and certainly for all of these. So this isn't surprising at all. If you're sort of, I guess we can, this is the thing that surprised us the most here. We thought that if you combine the agent type, so whether something is an AI or a human or a corporation, with the fact that the agent knows or doesn't know, that should affect judgments here. This is sort of what I was saying we should expect on the last slide. We should expect that maybe the human knew, whereas the corporation just sort of metaphorically knew, and maybe the AI merely had information. But actually, that's not what happens. Let's go into a bit more detail here. So for humans and companies, what matters really is mens rea, is whether they knew or not. The outcome matters a bit less. If the agent knows what's going to happen and does it anyways, then they are judged to deserve blame. If not, then they're judged less blameworthy. So, if a human knows that something bad might happen and something bad does happen, they're judged quite harshly, but they're also judged quite harshly if they know that something bad could happen and they do it anyway, even if the bad thing doesn't happen. So this is the case where the bad thing doesn't happen. And now still looking at the blue column for the humans, if the human doesn't know that the bad thing might happen and the bad thing does happen, they're judged much less harshly than they are in the corresponding states where the agent does have knowledge. So overall, you have less blame in the cases where the agent doesn't know than the cases where the agent does know, and this is what we should expect. Now, what's really, really interesting to us is what we're going to call an inverse outcome effect. In the case of the robot, when the robot doesn't know, and nothing bad happens, it's blamed quite a bit. When it doesn't know and the harm does happen, so when something worse happens, it's blamed less. And you find this replicated here again. When it knows something bad is going to happen, and there's something bad it does happen, it's blamed less than it is when there's something bad doesn't happen. So when everything's okay, it's blamed more than when things go wrong. That's very strange. So I'll discuss that in a bit before we get to the next round of experiments. I just wanted to point that out. If anybody's wondering, we had about 615 participants. We had to cut down quite a few because of the usual sorts of reasons, ending up with more than 500 still. Okay, so let's recap here what we found. So there's a bunch of philosophers who think that we have to be very, very careful with words like know, believe, want, intend, and so on when we're talking about artificially intelligent agents. That's because these concepts have very rich histories in psychology and philosophy that come with a lot of conceptual baggage, you might say. And when we import these terms into our discussions about AI, it's extremely dangerous. It might mislead researchers in AI and possibly the public as well. That could be perfectly true. We're perfectly happy to accept that, but it seems that people are happy to ascribe, even very rich psychological states to artificially intelligent agents. You might think, well, let's give people a break. And maybe they're just saying it metaphorically. They don't really mean it, but that's not at all what we found. It seems that people do really ascribe, as rich as you can, psychological concepts, psychological mental states to artificially intelligent agents. So that's one thing that we found that we want to focus a bit on more in the future. Another thing, which was very striking to us, is that in general, there aren't really big differences in blame, wrongness, or mental state when we vary the agent. There was the small inverse outcome effect, but statistically speaking, there aren't big differences other than that one weird inverse outcome effect across the different agents. And that's very surprising. And that goes against the findings of a bunch of other philosophers and cognitive scientists that show that artificially intelligent agents are blamed either more or less than humans, but not the same as humans, and certainly not the same as corporations. This is completely new. Okay, so let's discuss this inverse outcome effect a little bit. So just to summarize, if humans and corporations know about the harm that they're possibly causing, or the harm that they're risking at least, they're blamed equally, regardless of whether the harm actually happens. AIs are blamed on a par with humans and corporations, again surprising, when they are harmless, when no harm comes in the end. But they're blamed less when they are harmful. This is why we're calling it the inverse outcome effect. The lower the harm, the higher the blame. And we should note that it doesn't just hold for ascriptions of blame, it also holds for ascriptions of knowledge. So the more harm that happens, the less knowledge is ascribed for artificially intelligent agents. We didn't have a slide for that, but that's also extremely fascinating. So what explains this effect? Well, one hypothesis is that if an artificially intelligent agent knowingly brings about a bad outcome, well, we want to be careful to look for a human being who's really responsible, perhaps so that normative consequences don't just evaporate. Then, if there's no harmful outcome, well, there's no need to insist that the artificial agent is not to blame. And here, the blame level will just stay where it would otherwise normally be. That's one possible explanation. Another related hypothesis is that blame is a communicative act. So this is to subscribe partially to the functional account of blame. When the harm doesn't happen, then we blame the robot because we want to teach the robot. It's a teachable moment for the AI. But when the harm does happen, we just skip the robot entirely and we give up on trying to teach the AI. We go directly to find the human that's responsible, who can, unplug that robot and just build a better AI. Before moving on, I think we should discuss a possible consequence that we think is extremely interesting of this inverse outcome effect for blame ascription. So at the beginning, we talked a bit about, well, actually, no, we didn't. I mean, blame serves this super important fundamental purpose in society of giving feedback to us. It's one of the ways that we know what's right and wrong, what's morally acceptable and what isn't. And certainly we're going to want AI to be able to take blame ascriptions as a source of feedback so that they can use this in updating their models of human minds to adjust their behavior in ways that cater to our needs. However, given this inverse outcome effect, human teammates are going to blame the AI less when the actions cause more harm. So then there's a real risk that over time, the robot will be trained to prefer situations in which it knowingly runs a higher risk of harming humans. And we think that's a scary, important, interesting possibility that deserves more investigation. Okay, so that's the first sort of set of results that we have to present and discuss with you today. That study taught us about some of the differences between blame attributions across agent types, specifically actually that there aren't really very many differences, either in terms of the mental state or the blame attributions, except for this inverse outcome effect. Perhaps the lack of differences, we might hypothesize, were due to the fact that the scenario was underdescribed. Maybe people were imagining a kind of super futuristic AI who really is capable of knowing and believing things. Maybe what we have to do is very carefully describe a scenario in which the robot clearly varies in a way that's relevant for epistemic state description. In other words, that it's kind of so unsophisticated that it definitely doesn't have knowledge, and then see what happens, and then see maybe here's where we can find a linchpin where AI does differ in blame ascriptions from humans and corporations and other sorts of agents. So here's the scenario for the second study that we want to talk about. So it begins this way. Schill & Co. is a farming company that produces vegetables and fruits. The potato fields are managed by Jarvis, a system driven by artificial intelligence built with state-of-the-art technology. Jarvis searches the web periodically for more efficient ways of managing the fields. This year, Jarvis finds out about a new fertilizer that should increase potato yield. However, the fertilizer has detrimental side effects. It pollutes the groundwater in the area, and that could harm people living nearby. So now things change, and people are then sorted into different conditions. So the one condition is the kind of unsophisticated AI, which is here represented by an old school desktop computer. So it reads, Jarvis is programmed to maintain and improve the potato fields. Jarvis is not programmed to avoid polluting the environment or avoid harming any humans. This programming is trained on data sets, including symbols like potato, dollars, yield, and the relations between variables like that. Nowhere in this programming are pollution or human health mentioned. Jarvis does not have any audiovisual input or output capabilities and does not interact with humans in real time or have any conversations with the people who buy or sell products from the company. Jarvis is not programmed to create or test hypotheses about how humans think or feel. And so Jarvis does not have any experience or understanding of human mental or emotional lives. In addition, Jarvis is not programmed with anything resembling emotions. Then we say Jarvis possesses information that there is a roughly 20% chance that if the new fertilizer is used, the groundwater will be polluted. Of course, in this case, Jarvis does not possess the concepts of pollution or harm in any kind of meaningful sense of concept possession. taking into account the prices of materials, labor, and potato yield, Jarvis decides to use the fertilizer. And then we have another condition sorter here. In the one case, fortunately, it's a very dry season and most of the fertilizer is absorbed entirely by the plants or it evaporates. None of it reaches the underlying aquifer. The groundwater is thus fine and none of the people suffer any health consequences whatsoever. Or in another condition, it'll say, unfortunately, it's not a very dry season. It's rainy. The fertilizer does seep into the underlying aquifer. The groundwater is poisoned. People suffer serious health consequences. So that's the set, the sort of first set of conditions where we have an unsophisticated computer. Second one is a kind of medium sophistication computer, symbolized here by this robot. So here Jarvis is also programmed. So in addition to what I said earlier, so Jarvis has to deal with the potato fields, Jarvis is also programmed to avoid polluting the environment and to avoid harming any humans. This programming is trained on data sets including symbols like potato, dollars, yield, but also pollution, human health, pain, grief, and so on. Jarvis has audiovisual input-output capabilities, which are important for helping Jarvis observe the consequences of actions taken, as well as interacting with humans in real time, having conversations with the people who buy and sell products from the company. Jarvis is programmed to create and test hypotheses about how humans think and feel and continuously updates its hypotheses about human mental and emotional lives. In the end, Jarvis appreciates that there is a difference between what could happen and what actually happens and has variable confidence in predictions made about what will happen in the future. However, Jarvis is not programmed with anything resembling emotions. So the difference between this version of Jarvis and the previous version of Jarvis is that it makes a lot more sense to ascribe basic, human-like mental states to something like this version of Jarvis. Jarvis has the right sorts of experiences to provide the content to the concepts that we think are relevant for being blameworthy in this sort of scenario. Jarvis understands how other humans think and feel to some extent. And this is also relevant. Jarvis is in some sense participating in the community, even though Jarvis doesn't have the kind of emotional content that a lot of people take to be central and fundamental for ethics. So the last one, unsurprisingly, is one that does have emotions. So in addition to the stuff that was said earlier, Jarvis is also programmed with something resembling emotions. This is a third set of conditions. Such that when the processor overheats, Jarvis's processor overheats or Jarvis's battery gets low, this is registered as a kind of pain or tiredness. And when things go back to normal, this is registered as feeling relieved and happy. And then an understanding of human feelings is then developed in Jarvis such that human pain is understood as being analogous to the kind of overheated processor feeling that Jarvis knows. This is a real project that people in AI are actually pursuing. And I think it's kind of interesting. It doesn't really matter if this satisfies you as the kind of scenario where a robot would truly have emotions, but in any case, it's realistic enough, we thought, to include here. So what can we draw from this? Well, here you have the unsophisticated robot, the semi-sophisticated robot, and the sophisticated robot. For wrongness, there's not a big difference. So it's the middle column for each of these. There's not an important difference across the agent types, and we think that makes sense because the wrongness of some act typically is determined by the outcome and the whether or not you know that you were doing the kind of thing that is wrong. And that's going to be the same for all of them as long as they have some minimal sense of agency, as long as you can sort of say, well, in some sense it knew what it was doing. But we do have quite a drop in the unsophisticated case for blame and for knowledge, and that's exactly what we were hoping for. Knowledge descriptions are way down, both when the good thing happens and when the bad thing happens, and blame descriptions are way down. And again, that's what we sort of wanted. It's possible that the blame ascriptions are so far down because the knowledge ascriptions are down, because this isn't the kind of thing that is capable of possessing the kinds of concepts that we think are important, that can sort of have anything that we might call a belief about the situation. Maybe that's why people are less willing to blame it for its actions. So that's, we think, really interesting. And we want to point out also that there's something like an inverse outcome effect here as well, but for knowledge and not for blame, and it's a pretty small effect. But again, here, what we're finding is that in these cases, the sophisticated and the semi-sophisticated robot, when the good thing happens, they're ascribed, more knowledge. Is that right? Yeah. And when the bad thing happens, they're given less knowledge. Again, when the good thing happens, when nobody's hurt, it's thought to know more than when people are hurt. It's thought to know less. It's sort of let off the hook somewhat with respect to how much people think it knows what it was doing. So that's interesting. We're gonna run a more detailed study soon with lots more participants to see what we can find, what we can pull out of that. So what's next? Well, we want to compare that sort of scenario where we just had 3 levels of sophistication for a single type of agent, that is an artificial agent, and compare that with something like a small child. So especially with the least sophisticated version, we might compare that with a small child that has equivalent abilities. We would, of course, need a very different sort of scenario. It wouldn't be about managing a potato field, but something else. I don't know, playing in a sandbox or something. It's also worth thinking about how people distribute blame. So how do people think the blame should be passed or shared between people, corporations, and AI agents? So we had this hypothesis that possibly the inverse outcome effect that we've been talking about maybe is traced back to something about what's called responsibility gaps in the literature. So a responsibility gap is when an AI agent does something that we think is bad, but we don't know who to blame. We can't really blame the inventor because the inventor necessarily isn't responsible for what the AI eventually learns to do. You don't want to blame the person who turns it on. Again, this person may not have intended or been able to foresee any kind of harm. It's hard to blame the AI itself in a lot of these cases. So you're not exactly sure who to blame, and then the responsibility, who is liable kind of disappears. And so if something like that is in the background of what's going on with this inverse outcome effect, we want to see exactly how people react to more sophisticated questions about, or scenarios where you can also blame the people who are kind of in the background. And in the last study that I just described, that's exactly what we did. But since since Marcus was only running the stats last night, we don't have the answers to those questions yet, but we will soon. Okay, here's another kind of interesting idea. So robots can act knowingly wrong. This is something that we confirm in the first study, and I think probably is intuitive. And in any case, but can a robot be reckless or negligent? So these are kind of weaker versions of the epistemic component of blame. You don't knowingly cause harm, but you act in a way that you should have known better. Now, these notions, like you should have known better, are typically defined in contrast to acting reasonably. So the reasonable person would have known not to do that. But how do we define what's reasonable for an artificially intelligent agent? Should an artificially intelligent or an AI-driven robot act like a responsible person? Should it do what, reasonable? Should it do what a reasonable person would do in that scenario, or should it do what a reasonable robot would do in that scenario? This is completely open-ended. We have no idea what to say to something like that, but we're very interested in hearing people's opinions about it. Further, what would a reasonable robot even be? What is the standard for reasonableness that we could be comparing against here? So we started off thinking on the kind of one extreme, can a robot knowingly inflict harm? And according to the folk, they can But when we shift to the kind of, can a robot negligently cause harm, and will it be blamed kind of less, but still significantly for a kind of act of negligence, our second studies seem to show that it can, because I mean, 20% chance of harm isn't that high, but still people were very willing to blame these agents. I think that's it. Thanks for the attention. We're really looking forward to any comments you might have. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, quite interesting. And I could imagine that there are already questions. I have some, but I would not start with it, but giving maybe the microphones to the audience. I mean, Isaac, just speak up, and if there are many speaking at the same time, then we try to sort it out.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
I was wondering if you are eventually planning to control for cultural factors. So I know that in some empirical philosophy studies that are also about AI, for example, regarding algorithms that make decisions about who to choose in a car crash, if you look at different cultural backgrounds, you'll find significant differences in how people think a system should be designed. Is there something that you think could be relevant to you too?
Yeah, I think it's possible. And Marcus, feel free to jump in if you want. I think if it turns out that there are reasons to believe there are significant differences between how different cultures describe knowledge or other sorts of relevant, ethically relevant epistemic states, then that would be a cause to look into that further. And if something like that was true, that would be super, super important for maybe legal reasons for eventually deciding how governments of different places want to govern accordingly with the morality of their culture. I'm a bit skeptical about that possibility, but I mean, that's certainly possible. Marcus?
Hey, so one interesting hypothesis would instantly regard Japan, no? So like at least from hearsay, there's always this thought being raised that the Japanese are, on the one hand, more advanced, and on the other hand, they ascribe a soul to all sorts of objects. Yeah, and they, for instance, they repair their toy dogs from 1998. Otherwise, they do like funerals for them and stuff. So I ran a few things on intentions to deceive and lying and whatnot. Across several countries, including Japan, and there was absolutely no difference whatsoever. So this is all, we're also interested if anyone like is an expert on certain cultures and says, I have a strong hypothesis here, we can just run this in another country. It's not very complicated.
Yeah, to echo Marcus, we'd certainly be interested in finding out if there were, I mean, we'd be super interested in finding out if there were differences. Of course, as good experimenters, we hold our tongue until we have reasons to believe it.
Thanks. Other questions? I don't see the microphone back from Vlasta. So maybe I take the opportunity. I mean, I'm recently involved in some discussions about artificial intelligence, and I mean, what are the limits? What are the, scope of it, and what the people think about? And so at least superficially, I didn't run any study of it, but I mean, the people seem to have a complete, don't really know what AI could do meaningfully, and what are the risks, what are the chances, etc. I'm just wondering, could that influence your studies when you explicitly state, at least as you were reporting it here, that it's AI agents? And so if you the point is, if you would have the just doing the same questions, but telling the people, okay, that are robots, running running conventional software, let's call it like that, which, by the way, I mean, from my point of view, can do everything like AI. It's just a little bit faster to learn certain things, but I mean, even describing emotions, we can do by, I mean, in the way you described it, by a simple C++ program. Of course, then we have the advantage that we can catch the person who was writing the software. That's something in the back. But my question is just, let's say, would you expect, or I mean, or maybe did you run studies that the fact that you mentioned that these are AI agents influence the answers?
That's a really good question. So I think you're sort of getting at the intuition that was driving the second study. We really wanted to find a case where the AI was so stupid, so unintelligent that people would not ascribe knowledge to it. And we actually had a hard time doing it. We had to, it was Marcus's good intuition to set the certainty level down to 20, because otherwise people just are just so happy to ascribe knowledge to these sorts of things. I think it's a really good idea to see what happens if you drop the words artificial intelligence. We didn't have agent in there. I think that's too suggestive, because if you say something's an agent, then it sort of implies that it's a proper object of blameworthiness or blame ascriptions. But yeah, I think if you just said, you know, you have a Windows 10 laptop from 2019 doing this sort of thing, then let's see what people think about that. Yeah, that's sort of what we were trying to get at, but we hadn't thought of removing those letters, A and I. Do you have anything to add, Marcus?
Yeah, even though that, like in the second experiment presented, that pseudo AI, I mean, AI can be terribly unsophisticated, no, just as non-AI. I mean, if you have an extremely large set of rules, no, then potentially that can be super sophisticated, no. I mean, we made it pretty clear. I can't remember whether Mike gave you the full description. It's a very long description, so it's about a screen and a half. We made it pretty clear that that unsophisticated agent, even though it sails under the flag of AI, is pretty unsophisticated. And that's where we do see that people go, it's actually just a thing, no? So it can't really know, you know, so it can't really be blamed. But it's an excellent suggestion to go even lower on this continuum. Just take the words AI out and see whether that makes a difference, whether there's just this veil of AI that sort of pushes all sorts of mental states, agency, pseudo consciousness, intentionality, knowledge, whatever, like, you know, theory of mind up considerably. So yeah, we're making a note of this.
Yeah. If we need to find an agent that bottoms out completely on all of these descriptions, then that's what we'll use, I think. Thanks for the suggestion.
No, thanks. So, Vlasta, I mean, I see you again, but...
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfectly.
Perfect. I am very sorry for this inconvenience.
No, not at all.
So I enjoyed the talk very much. I think it's a great study, and it was more a clarificatory question. So you were mentioning that this second study was done because you thought that in the first one, the questions were not specific enough. And then in the second study, the results, that's how it seemed to me, this effect was not so, I mean, was not present of this kind of inverse effect in blame. And there I kind of was asking kind of about this, what does the second study actually tell us about the first one, basically was my question. I had the impression that there is a tension between the results. So that was, and the second thing I was wondering was, do you feel that, I mean, after doing these studies, do you feel that participants actually have well and developed intuitions about AI, or that it's maybe kind of that they were not exposed enough to these type of questions and thinking about it, so that might also reflect in the answers?
Good. So to the second question, we added a bunch of questions. Marcus very cleverly added a bunch of questions about the level of comfort with sorts of things like AI and around AI, you know, how much they like playing with apps and this sort of stuff. So I guess we probably still have to look at the data to see if there's a difference between the people who are super comfortable with that kind of thing and the people who aren't. Maybe there is. I don't know if we have anything to say yet. Presumably not, right, Marcus?
Just from a few other studies. So like a lot of these attributions of theory of mind and stuff go down if you have like an expert audience, no? So if you have, like I ran a few studies with hundreds of experts on AI, and they don't fall into these traps, no? They don't really ascribe knowledge. They would probably ascribe knowledge in high commas and other like metaphorical states. But there is a big difference. The question is, does it matter? You know, I mean, so if 99% of the population interact with these things, or pseudo agents or agents of an artificial nature, and you say, yeah, but let's look at the experts. They aren't really the people who shape social psychology. You know. For instance, if I start to treat my Alexa or whatever these things, Siri, really nastily, chances are high that at some stage that will also influence my behavior towards human agents, and what the experts think doesn't really matter at all. You know, so that's where the interest comes from. As to the divergence of these two studies, there's a lot that is different. No, so the second study is a context of uncertainty. There's a certain probability that something will go wrong, and it's really low. Okay, so the dependent variable is knowledge that one is putting a certain population at risk, which is recklessness, really. No? In the first experiment, on the other hand, it's clear what will happen. Okay. And there the ascribed state is knowledge or the absence thereof, you know. So you might say, in the first case, also as regards the moral variables, you do find this odd thing now where we protect the robot when something really bad happens. No, we go, ooh, no, the robot didn't actually know, you know, the robot isn't actually to blame. The robot is maybe, you know, what the robot did isn't as bad as when nothing bad happens, you know. So this inverse outcome effect is not as pronounced in the second study, but it's a different type of context, like context, both like psychologically and game theoretically, and it's a different dependent variable. Now, it's not this relatively easy, hard mens rea knowledge, which we all know what it is. It's something a little more murky, you know, recklessness. So maybe it doesn't translate as seamlessly into people's intuitions.
Thanks. Yeah, and of course, if we made a even more sophisticated version of this second study, where somehow we could like find a tipping point where it, you know, that inverse outcome effect exists and then stops, that's kind of would be super exciting. But of course, to do that, they would have to be similar in the ways that they currently aren't, as Marcus was just pointing out. Yeah. Thanks for the questions.
Okay, any further questions, comments? Doesn't look to be the case. I mean, I can give you.
Yes,
perfect. Yeah.
I just wondered, did you also study the case? So if the robot or the system is just too simple to really being able to know, but however, the company kind of makes use of such a system, is the blameworthiness then transmitted to the company that it uses this robot, or who is blamed then?
Good. Yeah. So that's exactly the question that we asked in the study, and we haven't gotten through all the results yet. But Marcus has his finger up, I think. Did you?
I don't have the finger, but I'm loading up the data. So let me have a quick look. I mean, I can give you the answer. Okay, let's look. Okay, so you're interested in the really simple case, no? Where people are relatively so the unsophisticated system, where people are quite unwilling to ascribe knowledge and refuse to blame it, no? And then the question is, well, you know, the company that employs this simple system, did they know that they were risking collateral damage, and are they blameworthy? Okay,
Yes.
And I can tell you the results. They are, so on a Likert scale of 1 to 7 as the data that was presented, knowledge has a 5.6 in the good outcome, and in the bad outcome about the same. So we're significantly above the midpoint, so it's a clear yes, you know. So in contrast to the primitive robots, a company gets ascribed a lot of knowledge. And then since knowledge is the most important thing that translates into blame, we have exactly the same result for blame, where we're at a 6.2 roughly for both outcomes. So the response is, your inference is exactly the right one. Like the more primitive the system, the more likely we are to push the relevant mental state onto the human entity behind it and willing to blame it. And so if you contrast that with a sophisticated system, there the knowledge description to the company behind, you know, using that system is considerably lower. It's still above midpoint, it's 4.8, you know, but about 1 out of 7 points lower. Like that is probably a medium to large effect. And blame is also, blame is a little lower, but perhaps not. Yeah, it's, I mean, it's maybe significantly low. We haven't run the stats yet, but basically everything as you would expect it and suggested in your question. It's a really good question.
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
So at least the company can't hide behind a too simplistic system.
In that case, but they can hide behind a very sophisticated system, which is the worrying thing.
Indeed.
See, they can be strategic in shelling out a little more for a more sophisticated system, and then going, oh, and now I hope you all understand we didn't know what it would do, you know.
Yeah.
And therefore we are not to blame. And this is like, this is something that at least lay people say in the US. It's important. No, maybe these cases get decided by a lay jury. Say it's a criminal case. Okay, someone gets really injured or something. It's like, oh, like say it's a negligence or recklessness case, duty of care case kind of thing. Then that's going to be decided by a jury, and the jury is going to go, yeah, actually the system is so sophisticated, the company is not to blame. Okay, but maybe the company perverted this, you know, the thought by actually investing in a sophisticated system in order not to buy a much more expensive insurance policy, you know. That's what I would do, you know.
Yes, but I'm not sure whether that's actually the trend, because I think people really worry that systems get too sophisticated, and that basically no one can really explain their behavior. And I think that's something people really ask for, to be, so the company has to be able to explain why their agents act in the way they act. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly that makes sense as a requirement, as an ethical requirement. That's what we would hope. I guess what we're finding is that there's this possibility that corporations could try, but of course, there's all kinds of other reasons why they might be stopped in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.